This next section, we're going to be focused on modern SOF strategy. Really, we're going to build off the framework that Desi Logan presented during her keynote. Additionally, we're going to have Peter Bergen, who's a senior CNN news analyst, to moderate the presentation for our 4 panelists. We're going to have about 50 minutes for them to engage in conversation. Additionally, we'll have about 15, 20 minutes of Q&A. Again, please think about some questions. We want this to be interactive. We want some provocative thoughts, some ideas to flow. So think about that as Peter moderates this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Also, we have an all-star panel. Directly to my left is Colonel Jewell, who's the director of the Adaptive Innovative Statecraft Unit at JSON, multiple combat tours in Iraq. Next to Colonel Jewell is Colonel Hooker, who, amongst other things, was Senior Director for Europe and Russia at the NSC between 2017 and 2018. Kind of an interesting time to be doing that. And also was the Teddy Roosevelt Chair at NDU. He's now a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Next to him is Ben Milligan, who was on SEAL Team 4 and 5. He just wrote this book, By Water, Beneath the Walls, The Rise of the Navy SEALs. I read 150 pages of it last night. I could not put it down. It is so good. It took him 7 years to write. And next to him is Colonel Collins, who is the Executive Director of the Viola Foundation, the editor of the Routledge Handbook on U.S. Counterterrorism in Irregular Warfare, which is an absolutely massive and authoritative book, which was done in the memory of Mike Sheehan, who was ASD Solik, and probably some of you remember Mike. He is also the co-author of Understanding Urban Warfare, which I think is going to be a useful discussion point here. And he used to direct the Counterterrorism Center at West Point. So I'm just going to start with Colonel Hooker, if you don't mind. Because you wrote what I thought was a rather provocative piece in the, which you can describe, perhaps, and give us I would say, a blistering critique of special operations as they are presently constructed. So go ahead.
Well, okay. Thanks for that, I guess. Still kind of wondering why I was invited to this conference. I want to lead off by saying what I said in my JFQ article up front, which is that undeniably special operating forces have a key role to play in national security. Undeniably, special operating forces have a key role to play in national security. I want to put that up front. But I hope to inject, some balance into the conversation today, and I hope I don't trigger anybody in the room, but maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. I'm going to give you a perspective from outside the SOF community, from the conventional community, but also I think from the policymaking point of view, which is informed by, I guess, my 3 tours on the National Security Council. So let's talk a little bit about some of the trends in the SOF community really since 9/11. So the first is a real explosion in size. So SOF doubled in size from 9/11 to the present day. How did it do that? The 4th Battalion was added to each SF group, along with a Special Troops Battalion, Military Intelligence Battalion added to the 75th Ranger Regiment, which also added the 4th Rifle Company, and a support company in each battalion, and on and on and on. I've got a document here that's put out by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, which I found really interesting in doing the research for the article. So I was kind of dumbfounded to read that where the Joint Staff has 2,390 folks assigned, and CENTCOM has 1,466. This was in 2020. U.S. SOCOM had 6,194. Well, now when you push this forward to the most current document, which is an estimate of FY22, the numbers are about the same for the Joint Staff, for the other combatant commands. SOCOM comes in at 73,923, which I think is the entire community. So why that methodology is applied to this number and to no one else, I'm not sure. But there is an answer out there somewhere. It might be to obscure the size of the SOCOM staff. It's not clear to me why the SOCOM staff needs to be exponentially larger than everybody else, but maybe somebody in the room can help me out with that. So a big explosion in size. So the obvious kind of question to that is, how do you maintain the quality of the force when you've doubled in size? So we'll get into that a little bit later in my presentation, I think. The DASI told us that soft forces, when compared to everyone else, are, not putting words in your mouth, dirt cheap, 2% or whatever. Well, they're pretty expensive, actually, because a lot of the costs are hidden in service budgets. So manpower costs, for example, is one, but many acquisition costs as well. Even so, SOCOM's budget request for the current year was larger than the entire defense budget of Poland, which is NATO's largest and strongest military, at least until Ukraine gets in, which hopefully won't be too much longer. So that's an interesting statistic. SOCOM's inventory of 30 AC-130J aircraft comes in at $165 million each. So that's more than an F-22, that's more than an F-35. And this is an aircraft that can only fly in permissive environments, is typically only used at night, and is almost never used in support of conventional units, even in extremis. Another example might be the AT-802U light aircraft, which is a modified crop duster that SOCOM intends to use for close air support and armed overwatch. And this program will come in at $3 billion. So, I mean, is that a example of an acquisition that's going to make a lot of sense in great power competition and high-intensity major theater war? Not so sure about that. I would say paradoxically, although expected to conduct operations with the highest levels of discipline and discretion, in fact, a disproportionate number of the most egregious mishaps in the war on terror befell SOF units. And I'm not going to give you a long laundry list, although I have one if you're interested. But if you picked a military disaster from 2001 up to about 2018 or so, there's about an 80% chance that it involved a SOF unit, not a conventional unit. And I think that calls for some inquiry into why that might be. In fact, there was an inquiry that was commissioned by General Clark in 2019 after some congressional pressure, which resulted in some findings which I thought were interesting, but not sure if it got to the bottom of that. It may well be, and you all might know better than me, it may have something to do with op-tempo. We can have a conversation about that. It may have something to do with the explosion in size of the force. It may have something to do with the connectivity or lack of connectivity with battlespace owners. There's a lot to unpack there. But I think this is significant. I think a major contributing factor to what we're talking about here is the strong tendency to wall off or to stovepipe special operations forces. So I'm going to throw a thesis out on the table here, which I believe is sort of an iron law of bureaucratic politics, which is that all organizations, Boy Scouts of America, First Presbyterian Church of Dothan, or U.S. SOCOM, they all want two things. They want the maximum amount of autonomy, and they want the maximum amount of resources that they can get. Now, some organizations prosper and are super effective at this. Marine Corps is an example that comes to mind. And some are less successful. I would venture to say that the U.S. SOCOM is spectacularly successful at this. So put yourself in the shoes of General Petraeus in 2007 at MNFI. And the poor guy has got direct control over Army forces. But the Marines are not task organized under him. The Air Force is not task organized under him as a theater commander. Black SOF is not task organized under him. And White SOF is task organized at the 4-star level, which means for tactical actions that are going on every single day, there is no relationship there. You can't monitor or manage those at the 4-star level. You just can't. So if you're a battle space owner, I'm sorry, you're going to have a lot of SOF units running around in your battle space, and I can tell you this from personal experience as a unit commander and 5 different campaigns, and you're not going to know that they're there. And maybe it's okay, and maybe it's not going to be okay. So that's a problem. So if we believe that unity of effort is important, then I submit we need to strive for true unity of effort, which means let's get aligned, synchronized, integrated, and coordinated on the battlefield. Let's not set up a huge wall so that we can be as autonomous as we want to be. And I know I'm being provocative here, but I think this is a conversation that needs to take place. H.R. McMaster has written at some length about the rating strategy that was that was carried out by SOF forces all through the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, which in a real way tended to work against the rest of the theater strategy. So if what we're trying to do is protect the civilian population and win the civilian population over to our side, which is a tenet of counterinsurgency, then constantly traumatizing the civilian population with night raids, some of which were successful, but many of which were not, tended to work at counter purposes to the theater strategy. It really did. And I think this is something that we need to learn from and think about as we project the role of SOF into the next era, which is going to certainly feature some elements of going after violent extremist organizations, but is probably going to have a higher priority of trying to posture to be effective and to contribute to our success in high-intensity major theater war. So I think these are some of the things that we need to think about as we look into the near term and to the midterm. I'd mention one other point in passing, which I do think is important and which I would call your attention to, which is when you have an explosion of SOF the way that we had in the last 20 years or so, it can only come at the expense of the leadership cadre of our conventional units. So by skimming the cream off the conventional units, there is a cost, and it's, I submit to you, pretty high cost. Army Special Forces or the Army SOF community probably accounts for something on the order of 5,000 non-commissioned officers, many of whom are at that critical E6 and E7 level, that are deposited now in the SOF community and can't be leading soldiers in the conventional force. That's a really big number. That's enough NCOs really to cadre about an Army Corps. So I guess the relevant question here is the return on that investment better by putting them in the SOF community, or would the return on that investment be better by leaving them leading soldiers in the conventional community? I think that's an interesting question. A quick vignette: my son was a platoon leader in the 82nd Airborne Division the day that Qasem Soleimani was killed. His battalion was on DRF-1, so no notice. They blew out to Iraq to secure the embassy. With none of its E6 squad leaders authorized, they had all departed for the Q course, and he was the 4th platoon leader in that platoon in 1 calendar year. His previous 3 lieutenants had all departed for Special Forces or the Ranger Regiment. And this is in the 82nd Airborne Division, which in theory is supposed to be maintained at the highest level of manning and readiness that we have. So it's a tough problem to deal with. As a battalion commander in the 82nd, I lost 16 NCOs in 1 calendar year to the Q course. That's a crippling blow. And you don't really have a vote as a commander about when these folks leave. When it's time for them to go to the selection, they go to selection, and you don't really get a vote in all of that. So I'll leave it to others to say if that is a price worth paying. I just want to flag for you that there is a cost or a price to be paid in terms of pulling a lot of quality leaders out of the conventional force as we reposture for great power competition and we move away from sort of the coin G1 environment. I'll close for that, but look forward to your questions. I hope there'll be some. Thanks very much.
My guess is there might be. Colonel Jewell, since you're one of the employees of SOCON as part of JSOW, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
You're very welcome.
A lot in that, and I'll address a little bit of it after I give you a little pitch from our perspective at the Joint Special Operations University. And the center that I am the director of has a long name, and Peter got it right, but we basically run the long-term research projects for the university. This goes to something Secretary Logan said and something you said, Richard, about learning and how to adapt to what we did. So our long-term history projects are social science research, history and theory informed, applied to current problems in the command, in the enterprise. Specifically, we're aligned now with SOCPAC, SOCUR, SOCAF, and SOC South on 4 of our key products. One is serving directly to our commander and his command teams as they're looking at how to transform SOCOM. People win, transform is the mantra in the headquarters, how to transform Special Operations Command and the SOF enterprise to contribute SOF peculiar capabilities to integrated deterrence in compound security competition to deter left of, for example, China invading Taiwan. For example, something changing in Europe with our acute threat even more troubling than it has occurred. And how do we build the force? And yes, build is what we're talking about, Richard, so that's a little opposite of what your suggestions are there, to be able to contribute those soft, peculiar things to deterrence, integrated deterrence with joint interagency, intergovernmental, multinational, and commercial partners. And these research projects are the engine of what President Wilson, the JSON president, calls SOCOM's Think Do Tank, because we don't do that just to serve those commands we're working with. We do that to cycle education and create knowledge back into the education of the SOF, of the combined joint SOF professionals for life. That's a sales pitch. I'm still practicing it. I've been in the job since January 1st. But during that time, we sat in on the SOCOM commander's decision roundtables, looking at a journey, as he describes it, to transform SOF, transform both the way we employ the forces, pushing that more down to the TSOCs and the commands, and how we manage the force as a service-like organization. That's a pretty big step after the GWAT years. One of the theories that JSOW proposes is a history and theory-based background to look at this practice. It's called the 4 Ages of SOF. I think Ben's book doesn't use those terms, but he landed on very similar things in it. So in the modern era of SOF, not counting special operations, unconventional warfare, regular warfare that occurred long before our Civil War, that occurred long before our revolution, that are worth studying in places as that history and theory. But we start about the time of World War II, when we started bringing together SOF as formations to apply in that context, support conventional operations. We weren't really doing a lot before, we were doing some with our partners, our British partners. Then in the 60s, in the Vietnam era, we grew the force to go along with more or less conventional operations, relatively low intensity, which is a term I don't love, but still, you know, the war in Vietnam. And then after Operation Eagle Claw was a huge threshold moment that we didn't foresee. One of those tragedies, one of those great tragedies, our conference room in JSOW is named after Eagle Claw. The changes that came from law, from Congress, not from the command, that set in motion the creation of the Special Operations Command, that set in motion the creation of the Assistant Secretary Directorate of SOLIC to go forward in soft, peculiar things. It also included education. Mr. Locker, who is one of the champions of that, who we talk with every now and then, has said that they didn't get the education part right. They did say we have a university, but we didn't get to all the things we think we need to educate soft professionals for life. In some people, Dave's mind, I think we are leaning towards being more service-like. That's Dave's opinion. How much more, Secretary, a lot of people have clearer visions on it. But that goes kind of counter to what Richard was saying here. I grew up in the conventional Army, almost entirely in the intelligence community, and I watched a lot of great talent move over in the special operations community. I just took that as a challenge to develop the talent we have and keep them enlisted in what their core tasks are, where they're different from soft peculiar. So now we have another threshold moment. Again, Eagle Claw, 9/11 was another one that caused us to go predominantly towards those CT functions and towards crisis response, which remains our no-fail function in SOF, at the expense of some of the other 12 functions we did. And now, at this threshold, after the end of the GWAT wars, we think to support integrated deterrence, in competition, the pasture remains fertile to grow in the areas of civil affairs, foreign internal defense, countering weapons of mass destruction, which SOF just actually got the responsibility for as recently as 2016, even though it had been one of our core activities going back to the beginning. And at JSOW, we're trying to set the education for SOF professionals so that we can learn from the bad examples and the good examples, apply theory to it, social science theory, international relations theory, apply technology to enable the way we learn. In the conversation earlier about machine learning and artificial intelligence, I was interested, and I said, I got some things to say, but that's not my expertise. But one thing we're doing with some of that in JSOW is trying to empower our education with geospatial tools informed by current social media, current news, and classical theory, geospatially accessible at the unclassified level for our professorate, for our students, for units. Much like the old CIA handbooks, you know, when I first went to a foreign country in the early 90s, make one of those that's enriched with current geospatial data. That's part of one of our research, it's alongside our research projects, because that information is very difficult to find in a unified space, certainly on the unclassified level, which is where we're working. And there is one thing I wanted to get to kind of respond to, Richard. It's not a debate. But again, I'm an Army intel guy, and I'm used to the three telling me I'm wrong about the enemy, and I'll say I've studied it for a while. One, I don't know the answer to why somebody reported the whole SOF formation as the same as the headquarters. I don't know. That's not correct. The other number was about correct. And the
Well,
money,
it was the Assistant Secretary of Defense who reported it, so
okay, and
not just somebody.
out of my realm, and I don't doubt the report. We don't have 73,000 people in Tampa.
I'm sure you don't.
We do not. You know, they wouldn't even all fit in the football stadium where the Bucks play. And the money, again, Mr. Innes and AT&L and the technology world's outside of me, but the soft peculiar of some of the weapon systems you named is a different addition to the force. It's a different addition to deterrence, integrated deterrence, to influence, I think. I've asked myself in the times, why don't we have the armed C-130s in the conventional force? I don't know, but they do provide something in a way of low visibility, something in a way of unique capacity that is soft, peculiar. And if SOCOM, and specifically if JSOW is educating on something that is not mostly soft, peculiar, then we're stepping on the grounds of the services or other folks. And so we try to find what's soft, peculiar, what's combined joint soft, peculiar in a JIMC, joint interagency, international, or intergovernmental, darn it, I always forget it. What's the multinational and commercial environment? And those are partnerships that JSOW, as part of SOCOM, has, where we are, as an organization, unencumbered by the classified work that SOCOM does. President Wilson went to Taiwan in December to have a discussion with the Taiwan National Defense University, that's not the exact name of it, education-based, which hadn't been done at that level, that included tens of 2- and 3-star Republic of China military and Department of Foreign Affairs leaders talking about what they educationally think they need to be concerned about the security of Taiwan. Small contribution, building a relationship that is not to replace what the military formations are doing, but then we come back and talk about that. And in fact, Indo-PACOM had people there, and so did SOCPAC. So that's part of what we're trying to do to work between. So I'm an employee of SOCOM. I'm the guy that my president looks at most of the time to work with what our headquarters does, because before I came to this job, I was in our headquarters being a typical, normal military planner guy, and try to translate that back into research for the education of soft professionals for life. I think I've gone too long, and I will stop.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to turn to Colonel Collins, who's also a retired Special Forces officer. I just want to inject also just into the conversation as we move forward. One of the premises of this discussion, I think, maybe I'm trying to unpack a bit, which is the GWOT is over, and it's all about great peer competition. And I'm reminded, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, Colonel Collins, but at West Point, the generation, the McChrystal, Petraeus, Odiano generation, the Vietnam War was almost like a verboten subject, and it was sort of put in the rearview mirror. And are we making some version of the same mistake now with it? Because obviously the national security defense, or, the Trump national security defense strategy, the Biden, they're very similar. They emphasize the same things. But are we going to make another version of the same mistake, which is by putting this thing in the rearview mirror, basically be unprepared for the next time something like this comes up?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's less of a mistake of that happening this time, but I mean, the DOD, we love to swing that pendulum, and if you want to justify a $700 billion budget, you have to have a huge enemy to justify that budget. So we want to, right, you've got to have an enemy out there to justify a massive budget. So you have that. And so, yeah, talking about the swing to the great power competition, so, I think a few years ago, SOCOM at times has kind of had this identity crisis of what's our role going to be in this? Are we going to lose our budget share as we kind of switch to great power competition, which is kind of unfathomable to me because you just have to look at our history or look at how they're employed, and that's not a fear. But I think there's a few reasons why this fear was probably why they had it. I mean, one is I've argued with Mike Sheehan and Mark Mitchell about why the office is called ASD SOLIC. Like, get rid of low-intensity conflict from the title. Names and titles matter. Means the rest of the services, anything to deal with low-intensity conflict, they just push off to SOF because that's where it belongs. It belongs in this office that's not ours when they have a role in it. And then SOF is then also left wondering if we belong to special operations and low-intensity conflict, what's our role in great power competition? Because that maybe isn't our realm when it's always been the realm. So just fix the title of the office and you'll fix some of these problems. And the third thing is we all know it's not low intensity if you're the one getting shot at. That's pretty frickin' high intense when that's going on. But I mean, titles matter, and I think that's one thing. But in terms of the great power competition, I've always hated this name too. It's great power conflict. If you think we're not at conflict with Russia and China, you're wrong. Ask them. Ask Chinese and ask the Russians. We are at conflict, right? The problem is we have this very narrow binary definition of war and not war, and that's not how they view the world. And when we view it from that perspective, we're always going to be a disadvantage for this great power competition. So I hate that word. But again, it's unfathomable to me that SOF would sometimes question what our role is in this when we've always had a role. We're going to be employed, right, as Aaron said earlier, right, massive role in this. But I think part of the problem is, right, coming out of the GWAT in 20 years of this. So that's 20 years, so you have an entire generation of officers, that's all they know, right? And during this, there was, I will agree with some of the points Richard made, and I'll disagree with others. But part of it was there was way too much SOF doing direct action during the conflict, right? Maybe the SEALs should be doing it, Rangers should be doing it, select elements of SOF doing it, but too many times Special Forces elements were doing direct action when they should be building a host nation force, and that was not helpful. I remember in Ramadi in 2004, talking to an ODB commander, so an SF company commander that had 6 detachments in Iraq, and he was being directed to do foreign internal defense, and he said, I don't want to do that. We want to go do targets. I'm like, as opposed to developing a 350-man or battalion, and then you'd have all these intel assets for them to hit targets. They could hit so many more than you could hit. But part of the problem is, right, that's what SOF attracts, right? SOF attracts a bunch of people that want to do direct action, and that is not the primary role of SOF. For a small number of SOF forces, that's it. You're talking National Mission Force, Rangers, and the Army. That's the main thing, right? Not Special Forces, but that's who they attract. And then you wonder why you have this dissonance between what they want to do and what they're going to do. To hit up on some of the things Richard talked about, I'm not sure I don't doubt that was the case in his environment about the, black SOF or white SOF running around and not being coordinated. I can just tell you everywhere I operated, that was never a problem. Before I did any raid, I talked to the owning force on the ground about it. After we got done, I talked to them. And that was whether it was with General Odierno on down to the lower level or General Mattis. I remember a time where, right when we were building General McChrystal was building all the liaison networks, expending them everywhere, and he came to visit General Mattis, and he said, I don't need a liaison officer, I got Liam here. But he was right, he needed a liaison officer because I'm working full-time, I can't spend all my time at the division. But I disagree with that. We had unity of effort everywhere I was at, even if we didn't have unity of command. They're going to be different, and that's the problem that's got to be addressed, but I don't think that's the solution. And the owning forces, it was never a problem. I remember another 4th Infantry Division, they had a brigade operations officer called me up one time and said, hey, do you know anything about this target? It was white SEALs who were hitting the target. And I said, nope, just tell them not. Did they tell you why they're hitting it or who it is? And they said, no. I said, tell them they can't hit it. You own the terrain. They can't hit it if you tell them not to hit it. I'm like, I tell you every single target I'm going to hit, because for all I know, you have a relationship with them. I don't even need to hit the target because you can go out and get them for me. And so I disagree with that to some extent. Right, the talent problem, or the talent drain that you were talking about, Richard, I mean, I think that's not a problem of SOF stealing people. I think it's a problem with the conventional Army that people wouldn't be leaving it, more than likely, in terms of why are they going to SOF? Because it's not being handled, right? They aren't seeing satisfaction in the conventional Army. And the Ranger Regiment actually is a benefit to, right, the Army. They don't go there and stay there. They go out there to Ranger Regiment, and they come right back after doing time there, and take those skills. So I would disagree about those forces stealing talent from the service. I think the problem's probably more with the service level than anything else. In terms of, yeah, I mean, budget, yeah, I would agree right there. We have an insatiable, amazing ability to grow and spend money. I'm a little concerned, not with soft growth, because there's plenty of missions there, right? We'll never have the missions that we'll always have more missions than we can ever execute again. Why should we ever have an identity crisis? Never, right? We will always be, there's more things we can do than we will ever do, and things that we should be doing, but we're always going to be short of people. My greatest fear with the growth is we were never at 100% before we added 4th battalions. We were never at 100% before we added squadrons. How the heck can you grow when you've never had you just have so many talented operators or analysts or whatever it is to put in these places? That's the bigger problem to me. Right, the people are the most important thing, and I always joke, it wasn't a joke, but right, if you have what's supposed to be a 12-person detachment, and you go from 9 to 10, but that 10th person is a negative, really, you've grown from 9 to 8, because you've got to have somebody watch this person that's right, can cause massive strategic harm to your nation, right, by these people out there, as I think Richard kind of pointed out some of those things. The last thing I'll say in terms of, we shouldn't insert, I'll talk about the forgotten soft forces here briefly, civil affairs and PSYOPs that we never talk about, but they're part of it too. We should not send forces somewhere without actually having a way to actually measure their performance, and you can do it, right? Too often we measure, right, measures of performance, not measures of effectiveness, and there's ways to do this, right? Survey data, other ways to do it. But was doing a project for one of the civil affairs groups, and because they had multiple elements out there in Europe, all doing kind of similar things for different purposes all over Europe. And I said, well, how do you know if you're effective? He's like, I have no idea. That's why I'm coming to you and have the cadets look at this project. Are we actually being effective? And so figuring that out, like, right, they're a small asset. Let's figure out where we can deploy this asset so we can get the most return on the investment. And so you got to think about, how do you actually measure that going in? And if we can't measure it, sometimes there's ways to get at it, right? But that should be part of the process when you're thinking about deploying an asset. How do we measure its actual effectiveness? And what do we mean by effectiveness? So that's kind of it. But bottom line, SOF has a major role to play in great power competition, right? Building host nation capability, right? Access and placement. Building these relationships we can lever. One of the best examples and a success story during the last 20 years is OEFPI, the Philippines, right? Very small footprint. Why did it work there? Because no one in the U.S. military cared about it, because we were all in Afghanistan and Iraq. So you had a very small force being very effective there, and more often than not, right, SOF is most effective when we're actually forced to stay small, like we did in El Salvador, we did in Colombia. Again, Colombia wasn't effective from counter-drug, but effective from counterinsurgency. Right, Philippines, right? These are places, and so one of the lessons is, hey, we have to be artificially restricted to being small, or we will grow too big, and you actually grow to be ineffective. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Ben.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, right, he didn't mention that I'm also a fellow with New America, which Peter is the president of New America, so.
Vice President,
Vice President.
who cares? So, Ben, you did, I have a terrible pun here, you did the deepest of deep dives on the history of the U.S. Navy SEALs. What are the lessons? And I'm only 150 pages in, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And one of the lessons I took away was how many times certain units were kind of created for specific situations, and then sort of disbanded over time as the rationale for their existence seemed to fade, or because of bureaucratic infighting. As you look forward to, the pivot obviously is from the GWOT to great power competition, even if you don't necessarily agree that actually is the main, that's where the defense establishment is. So based on your sort of own historical understanding of all this, how do you see this playing out for the units that grew up so spectacularly in the war against terrorism?
I don't know.
Yeah. Great answer.
Let's
Make
see.
it up. You're
Right.
Just make it up.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for
Yeah.
the question. Thanks for my co-panelists, and thanks for the invitation, Mike, to be here. This is my first panel, so this is a treat. To catch everybody up to speed on what Peter is talking about, the early history of SOF is in fact very choppy. There's periods of stagnation, explosion, merging of units together. One of the thing that Peter mentioned was particularly the early creations and disbandments of various units. That happens lots of times. So probably the best examples of that are the Marine Corps Raiders that are created in 1942. They have some sort of spectacular operations. They're publicized in a very popular movie at the time, and a few weeks after the movie comes out, they're disbanded. Similar thing happens with the Army Rangers. Army Rangers are created in 1942. Half of the Rangers are committed to a disastrous raid in Italy. They're disbanded. The 3 other Ranger battalions continue on in World War II. 1945, no more Rangers. Korean War comes along. Army needs a sort of raiding capability again. They reestablish the Rangers. 8 months after that, Rangers are disbanded again. They're not reestablished as a real force. There's sort of Ranger-type units that are brought back in Vietnam, but the Rangers, as we know them, are not really recreated until 1974. So there is this period of sort of creation, disbandment, merging together. And so I think the question that we're all sort of trying to understand in this room is how do we move forward into this new environment where we have these new threats? Great power conflict, as Liam said. Well, I think it's interesting to know, at least for that first 20, 30-year period of SOF, we were always in great power conflict. I mean, we've been in a new generation now where we've had this maybe incorrect perception that we haven't been in great power competition or conflict because we've been focusing on insurgency groups, low-intensity conflict stuff. But if we want to understand why we are in the current situation and how to project forward from that, how we have 130 C-130s, why we have, as Colonel Hooker said, a potential talent drain from the regular service branches, why we have, or why the ASD SOLIC position has that low-intensity conflict acronym at the end of it. I think we have to understand how we got here. And one trick that you learn is, if you are a historian, if you're going to write history, is in order to understand why questions, the first thing that you need to do is understand what happened. Put things in order. Why will always come to the surface if you just start to put things in order. And I think most of us have this idea that special operation history is this story of tension. Tension between conventional leaders and unconventional leaders. And that's true. It absolutely is true. There have been biases in the military against elite troops from the very beginning of our history. Most notably, we start to see them in World War II. You have leaders like Mark Clark, even leaders like Eisenhower and George Marshall that are very, very reluctant to create elite troops within the ranks. One, because they don't want other troops to feel like their service is less important than the elite troops, but also for practical reasons. They don't want the best troops in their organizations to flee and join those other better more famous or more whatever you want to call it, those other units. So there's practicalities, and those are absolutely all true. Those all happen, and they're part of the story and how we got here, and they're part of that tension. But it's also worth us remembering that all of the unconventional units that we have today were all started by conventional leaders. We have leaders throughout our history that never served a day in anything you would even consider remotely special or unconventional. Admiral King, Kelly Turner, John McGee, Bill Darby, all of these guys, they all came from conventional units. So I think it's important to really understand how the real story happened. We got here, or the tension that existed is, I think, really was a result of partly great power competition. It was difficult in those early years of special operations to sort of figure out where there was a place for these sort of behind-the-lines raiders, or behind-the-lines whatever. I always, when I was doing research for the book, I sort of created a little matrix for myself to understand what a special operations unit was. And I started to, with all the acronyms of things that special operations forces do, I boiled it down into I call the 3 R's of special operations: recon, wrecking, and raiding. But in order to understand, what a special operation was, I started to think about well, what defines a special operation? Because you could have an elite unit or a special unit that can be doing a conventional operation, or vice versa. You can have a conventional unit that's doing a special operation. So what is a special operation? So I started to think, okay, well, it's usually behind enemy lines, and if it's not behind enemy lines, it's at least beyond the forward line of troops. So if you're going to have a unit that's going to be operating in the forward line of troops or behind enemy lines, it's going to have to move at night at some point. It's going to have to get to its target or wherever. It's going to have to be done at night. In order for that unit to move at night, it's going to have to be small. For a unit to move at night effectively and quietly, it's got to be small. And because it's small, it has to be targeting a target that's vulnerable. So that little triangle helped me kind of understand. So those 3 things, if they got out of whack, then it ceased to sort of be a special operation. Anyway, so how do we get this institution that we have now? And I think that's the biggest story of American special operations. We have this whole period where all of these sort of patchwork units are operating independently. But now we have this, as Colonel Hooker was describing it, we've got this massive industry of special operations that is protected from the top, it's supported from the bottom. It's how America does everything. We take something small and we build it up into a major corporation. And the fear now being, well, are we more bureaucratic? Probably. Are we less able to respond to current threats? Possibly, yeah. But there's a reason that we have that bureaucracy, because there were all of these other things that sort of forced us to create that bureaucracy. So if we look at what happened in history, I think we can get there. Anyway, I could keep going, but I'll stop for now.
Let me ask Colonel Collins, because you just came back from Ukraine. I mean, obviously one of the big successes in the Ukrainian war is Ukrainian SOF, and Major General Repass has been part of that, who some people here may know. I mean, and now, of course, the training is sort of being done over FaceTime, essentially. I mean, right, it's not in theater. So why was that a success, and what is the likely outcome going forward, given the fact that it's not hands-on in the same way?
Yeah, first I'll answer, I'll say it was a failure to deter, and I think we could have done it, but there was no will in the U.S. government to actually do it. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that, if that's okay. Partly because, there was no punishment for Russia in 2008 following their invasion of Georgia, nothing in 2014, 2015 following their initial invasion and illegal annexation into Ukraine. We did have a $300 million, roughly year investment that we were doing over there, and I spent 2 years going back and forth with General Abizaid, so I understand, kind of saw the Ukrainians evolve from 2016 to 2018. We asked, one of the things we did, and this was, one of the many signals, is we asked both the Shape Commander and we asked General Mattis to put a general officer in charge of the ground of the effort in Ukraine. We had a 200 to 300 man joint military training group. You train over there, training them. Half a dozen Ministry of Defense advisors over there, all these other kind of in and out things, and $350, $1 million aid package. And you look at other places where we've had this kind of thing. Pakistan, when we needed to go into Pakistan, right, and needed help from them, we put Mike Nagata there. When we, Israel, Saudi Arabia, some other places, right, when you need it, that's a signal, right? And it's a signal to Russia, you care about it. But the answer was, we don't have a general to give, or admiral to give despite having 620 in the Department of Defense. It meant we didn't care and we were communicating to Russia we cared. So bottom line, it was a failure to deter, and we are where we're at today. But yeah, the Ukrainians, I mean, one of the things, everybody that we talked to over there over a 2-year period, every single person said they're not Iraqi or Afghanis, right? If you look at what can the U.S. do, what does the U.S. not do well? We don't build a military on scale in a nation where there's no political will to do it, and no one's good at that, right? That's why it failed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that's why it worked in Ukraine. The political will is behind it. They're the ones that wanted to reform and turn Western. You'll probably, if you go to the panel later today, you'll have somebody be very critical of it. But you know, I'll cut it shorter on there, but bottom line is the SOF did a very good job training theirs. They basically stood it up from scratch over there. Because they're kind of better at building it than some of the other conventional assets. So, you know, have built it pretty effective. And so, yeah, what's really dependent on Ukraine is continued Western aid to support the Ukrainians, because you basically got a military that's got the advantage in every category except for mass. Mass is the one category Russia has the advantage. And so they got to kind of continue to replace those weapon systems. But yeah, they did a good job of building it.
Because I think on Iraq, I mean, I would respectfully disagree. I think with the Iraqi counterterrorism service, it's one of the sort of great unheralded successes.
But niche force, very good at building a niche force.
Okay.
We can't build a force on scale.
Gotcha. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, so we have about 15 minutes of questions, so please engage.
Eric Donahue, I'm an assault team leader at Development Group. I have a question, Dr. Collins, based on what you just said about the efforts in Ukraine. Could you give some examples of what is the Ukrainian Special Forces are doing that makes those operations defined as special, kind of according to the 3 tenets that Mr. Milligan spoke about? A lot of the stuff, you know, we see in the news and open source media seems like it's mainly conventional warfare that's taking place during the daytime. Would you be able to give some examples?
Yeah, I mean, just think of the defensive key, for example. It's really hard to understand the Ukrainian army coming in with a Western perspective or a U.S. perspective of how wars are fought. Like, it's kind of like our inherent distrust with our government. They kind of have that the Ukrainian population has this inherent distrust with their military. And so going back to 2014, right, a massive number of volunteers went out to the east to really defend against the Russian-led separatists. So they have this really weird construct where you have this, you know, standing regular army, but then you still have these massive volunteers from the defensive Kyiv. You would have civilians basically running the drones, establishing all the named area of interest, like looking out there, talking right there with commanders. So where was some of their special forces role in this? Most of their force were out east. They really thought the attack was going to come here. So they're really left with the 72nd Mechanized Brigade kind of defending the capital, and they're really kind of just at the edge of the city limits as far as they went. Pretty much everything forward of that was just civilians carrying weapons and kind of SF out there kind of working with them. I mean, as an example, right? And so they're working with those guys, or they might have the, you know, RPG or an in-law, and then they're kind of working with the ambush as they approach to the conventional forces. So just kind of strange in that way. I don't think they've had as much success really kind of building that resistance network, and I think there's a couple reasons why. I don't want to get too much into Ukraine because we're going to hit it later. You know, we got a separate panel for it, but I think it's because, right, one is a lot of Ukrainians are just leaving, right? When the war comes to you, you get the hell out of there, right? I mean, most people leave cities and the ones that are left, so I think you haven't seen as much resistance as you could, and part of it was that those resistance network to be most effective had to be set up in advance, and they weren't set up in advance. I mean, even I did a video teleconference with kind of the forces responsible for defending Kyiv, and this commander is basically, you know, 3 weeks before the war started, you know, no one believed that the Russians were going to invade, so they really weren't prepared for it from that perspective. And then I think they're doing some deep raids too. But yeah, I mean, but it's a weird construct the way you would never have a civilian come to the bunker on the second day of the war and come up with a plan to blow a dam and then just say, go here, we'll give you an engineer, go to the ammo supply point, pick up a ton of TNT or dynamite and blow the dam. It's just unheard of.
In the absence of other questions, do you have a question? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Will Myers. I'm an assault team leader over at Gabled Stone. For Colonel Hooker, and Dr. Collins, you kind of got on this as well. How do you resolve the conflict in your mind if special operations is a drain on the talent of the conventional force? How do you resolve the issue of the fact that, it's not like, if you're a conventional guy, it's not like you're going to stay in the conventional Army if you don't go to SOF. Maybe you just get out of the Army. As we talk about it being a drain, maybe it's just an opportunity. Someone like myself, I've been in the Army 16 years. I wouldn't have been in the Army 16 years if I had to stay conventional. Colonel Hooker, how do you address that?
Well, if you break that down, I think what you're really saying is all these guys that migrate to the SOF community are either going to migrate to the SOF community or they're going to get out. There's just no social science behind that. There's no data behind that. That's all anecdotal stuff. The E6s that go to selection and don't make selection typically don't all get out of the Army because they've got 10 years, 8 years, 11 years invested. They're looking at retirement down the road. So the community is very large. There's going to be a suction pump effect that's going to draw talented or quality leaders, into that side of the force. The question that we need to be asking at sort of the policy and the strategy level is that where these folks make the biggest contribution? At the end of the day, you don't win wars with commandos. You just don't. You'll win them probably with heavy divisions and with air power. Now, as I said it in my very opening remarks, there's a key role for SOF to play in the national security toolbox, no doubt about that. But my critique is that we've become unbalanced. That's all. I'm just trying to, promote this idea that we need to sort of rebalance. Let's get back into the joint game. Let's put all the tools under the Joint Force Commander and stop taking tools away from the Joint Force Commander so that we can integrate and coordinate and synchronize and get better effects on the battlefield. Okay, the community's been fighting against that for a long time. We need to get back, I think, to first principles and we'll be just fine.
Colonel
Thanks.
Hooker, you also, quick sort of follow-up, which is, there may not be 72,000 people in Tampa, but there's certainly at least 60,000, and most of them are civilians, right?
6,000.
6,000, okay. Yeah, I mean, are there too many civilians in SOCOM?
Well, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that, but I can tell you how many there are. There are, of that 6,194, there are 2,000 civilians. So maybe, I don't know, you tell me. It's a lot of civilians.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that. Richard, you talked about data. I'd like to see the data because with as many 18 X-rays that special forces that come right in from the street, as many of them that come into the force, I find it hard to believe there's more NCOs going to SF now than there were 10 or 20 years ago. I don't see that as possible with the numbers perspective.
If I could just interject a couple of data points, and I apologize I didn't bring these specific numbers, but I can tell you that we have collected data, and the significant majority of folks who go through selection and do not make it actually do have a track record of going back to the regular forces and becoming some of the longest serving and most senior members of the NCO Corps. So we do have data that I think shows almost the reverse, that we become pillars, sort of important pillars for the regular conventional force for those who don't end up making it. Not as many actually leave entirely, but they actually stay in at a higher rate and stay in for longer careers. I'll also point out that I think the better comparison for the headquarters numbers in Tampa is if you look at what it takes for the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines, the military service side, because that headquarters is both a military service side and a GCC operational side. There are two hats that are worn by that commander that is very unique, similar to the role that actually Secretary Mayor ASD Solik wears as a operational policy advisor for the secretary, as well as a service secretary-like role. And so it is a little bit complicated to unpack those specifics, but I do think that some of the questions that, Colonel Hooker, that you raise are really good ones for us to reflect on, because I think for us to meet the challenge we set ourselves of continuing to be better, we have to question our underlying assumptions. And I think it's always fair to say, what more can we do better, and are we giving the nation the return on investment? And I do believe that we are rebalancing the force to be more effective in competition spaces and to effectively help pathfind for the joint force in certain ways in this space. And I think that's an important role that we like to play as pathfinders. But keeping that balanced with not failing in our no-fail missions, including those for CVO, I think is really important. But I just wanted to set like I said, it's not a debate, but I did want to set the record straight that we do have some data about the impact on the conventional forces, and that's actually a little bit counterintuitive, I think. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being panelists today. My name is Michelle Poe. I am in the Army under USASOC. I've been in for 18 years, and I'm a member of the PRK cohort. One class that we've been taking this semester is Rethinking Special Operations, and we've been examining how SOCOM has 70,000 personnel across the globe to conduct global operations, and how certain elements of it are bloated and have too many people. And Colonel Hooker, as you stated during your brief, basically once 9/11 kicked off, there was an ever-expanding number of elements being added to Special Operations Forces. Now that CT is winding down after 20 years, and it may be time to start cutting away those certain elements, one thing we've been talking about in class is the government prepared to cut down special operations, to kind of direct it from the top down, and how in an environment where we are not used to saying no, or used to essentially saying, I'm sorry, but these 100 people have to go back to the Army, how do we do that? Is there any ideas from the panelists?
Well, you might have thought that as the GWAT began to wind down, and that really wasn't something that happened in 2020, that happened in like 2014 or so. You might have expected that just as the conventional force began to decline in size, so too with the SOF community. In fact, that has not been the case. So the additions that were made at the height of the GWAT remain in place today, and year by year, the requests are actually more for augmentation than for reduction. So I would suggest that one of the reasons that the SOCOM staff is as large as it is not to make it more rapid and agile and responsive, but to make it better able to contend and compete in this competition for resources inside the Beltway, which it does very, very effectively. I mean, it's true that SOCOM has some service-like functions. That's undeniable. But the Army staff is tasked with looking after, when you include the reserve component, almost 10 times as many people, more than 10 times as many people. So the idea that both staff should be the same size, it seems to me, is problematic. I don't expect to see a sharp reduction in the size of special forces, although I think one of your foundational strategic documents, makes the point over and over and over again that quality is more important than quantity. I think it's unarguable that if you get twice as big, you're not going to be able to maintain the same level of quality as you had before. I just think that's unarguable, and may contribute to some of the bad things and disasters that we saw happen over the last 10 or 15 years. I don't think you're going to get a lot of senior people agree with that, at least not publicly, but I think it's something that's certainly true. And I don't expect the SOF community to decline in size. I don't. I mean, I just don't think it's the kind of issue that rises to the level of the president's attention, and I think it would take presidential intervention for something like that to happen.
This lady over here.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Jackie Deal from Long-Term Strategy Group in Washington, D.C. And I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit to how well we're doing, or how well either the Joint Force or the SOF community is doing at understanding the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party as a competitor or as a opponent. It took a while, I think, for us to get up to speed on terror networks and the radical Islamist threat. How would you say we're doing on understanding our peer foe today?
I'll take a jump at this, and this is from both me as a researcher and as an old intel guy. I think we're doing about as well as we can, and it's part of the research. Chinese military and educational institutions publish a lot. They publish a lot. They publish a lot unclassified. We have pretty good intelligence access to a lot of the other communications at a lot of levels. It stops at the top tier of the CCP, though. So what is the PLA or the PLA Navy likely to do in a certain situation? I think we have SOF perspective, and I think joint force perspective, a fairly good idea. But what's going to happen with G and his 6 or 7 closer ones, we don't. That's Dave's opinion. I watch him really closely, trying to answer our commander's question, how do we get G to say, not today, to go to Taiwan? So there's a gap there.
But isn't that gap just maybe baked into the situation, which is Xi himself may not know what he wants to do?
Absolutely, that's my own, and yes. As an old S2 in the Army, one time, an Armored Battalion commander asked me, how come you can't tell me what the enemy infantry battalions are going to do at NTC in 2 days? I said, well, here's your Armored Battalion commander, your buddy, you live next door to him, what's he going to do in 2 days? And he doesn't know. So yes, that is part of it. And also, ESG is very powerful and very well protected and has, by their law, pretty much absolute control. I feel we know more about it than we did about the inner workings of ISIS when they started rising. I think we know more about it than we did about the inner workings of Al-Qaeda before 9/11, shortly after 9/11, because they write a lot.
One final comment from Dazzy Logan.
So I don't want to cut short the discussion on PRC and our understanding, but I did want to say, I think the other thing that is important to keep in mind, not only I don't think that we've grown too large in SOF as we've shifted, and I think the roles that we are playing and continue to play. But part of that comes down to a very basic fact, which is our most senior national leaders keep turning to SOF. They keep asking SOF to do the missions. So if the president keeps asking us to do these missions, we are using our force fully today. They are fully occupied. There's nobody sitting around just thinking great thoughts, except maybe the few of you in this room who are at this class. But in general, the vast majority of our force is fully employed, and they keep being regularly employed for a spectrum of things that arguably, in some cases, you could have conventional forces doing, but the senior leadership of this country doesn't appear willing to take that chance for whatever reason. And so I think that is the fundamental factor that there are a lot of people who have raised the questions that Colonel Hooker has, is have we grown too large? Can we maintain the quality? The flip side of that is, I think, using a lot of what we've learned over the last 20 years, we actually think that our assessment and selection process have gotten much better. And so in some ways, our ability to maintain quality has improved even as we have grown. And that is a little bit of a counterbalance, but there clearly is a limit. And I think that's where we ask ourselves, are we being used in the missions that give the biggest return, again, on investment for the nation? Because while we are where we are, and arguably there are certain places we would love to grow, we actually can't really grow very effectively. I think there is a real limitation there that you identify. I don't think we hit it today, but I think we're very close. And so that actually becomes a frustration as national leaders ask us to do even more in certain spaces where we haven't been able to grow.
Thanks to our well-informed and lively panel.